Alrighty, good evening and welcome to our living room lecture series. Thank you for joining us tonight. Our presentation will be Archaeological Explorations in the Western Colorado Desert with Michael Sampson. My name is Dante Ferenga and I am the Development and Marketing Director at the San Diego Archaeological Center. Just a few quick announcements before we get started. Our next living room lecture will take place on August 10th. Susan Hector will present on cotton and wool textile production in historic California and how the continued production and use of these fabrics represented the diversity of cultures in Southern California during the historic period. Registration for this event is now open on our website. On Saturday, July 8th, we have a couple of our past lectures screening in the center classroom. These happen every second Saturday, and the July screening will include Block 112, The Untold Story of San Diego's Working Class in the 1880s, as well as Polynesian Contact in the Americas. No reservations are necessary, and we hope those of you who are local can join us. More information about the center, our curation efforts, and our programming can be found online at sandiegoarchaeology.org. Tonight, we will be using the Q&A feature, which you can find on your Zoom control panel. Please feel free to submit questions at any time, and they will be answered at the end of the presentation during the moderated Q&A. Now, I am very pleased to introduce Michael Sampson. He is a retired California State Parks archaeologist who worked throughout the state of California, but primarily in Southern California. Michael has an MA in anthropology from Washington State University, and he is co-director of a nonprofit research organization, Center for Research in Traditional Culture of the Americas. Michael co-authored the California Archaeological Resources Protection Act, along with Dr. Susan Hector, for which they were awarded a Governor's Historic Preservation Award in 2011. He is also a longtime volunteer in Old Town San Diego State Historic Park. And without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to you, Michael.
Thank you for joining this lecture tonight. I've been studying the Western Colorado Desert on and off for over a period of 4 decades. This area for which I refer encompasses a broad stretch of eastern San Diego County, portions of western Imperial County, and the southernmost portions of Riverside County. With an area of study so vast, I've been selective in what I am presenting tonight. Importantly, I'm only discussing areas that have been the subject of my own field work, documentary research, and in-person studies of museum collections. Here is a typical setup when I examined Malcolm Rogers' collections at the San Diego Museum of Man. Deserts have served as places for humans to seek spirituality, wisdom, and revitalization, as places to obtain daily sustenance, as corridors for exchange or migration, and as centers of myriad other cultural activities throughout human history. The solitude, spaciousness, colors, star-spangled night skies, and the often stunning, enthralling landforms of the desert generously feed the human consciousness. The undiffused weather conditions, either unbridled heat and winds, summer downpours and humidity, or the cool evenings of winter, and plant life of uncommon, fierce beauty, fuel the intensity of the human experiences in the desert environment. The archaeological, ethnographic, and historical record of the Western Colorado Desert profusely and evocatively exemplifies the cultural significance of the desert landscape. This study area holds a diverse range of landforms, plant communities, animal habitats, and geological formations. A noteworthy aspect of the study area is its desert riparian zones, such as Coyote Canyon, Carrizo Creek, San Felipe Creek, well-watered cienagas, palm oases, as well as numerous springs. Much of the Colorado Desert lies within the lower Sonoran life zone, though upper Sonoran life zone communities and even some transition life zone vegetation are present. Numerous economically important plants are found within my study area, such as agave, creosote bush, desert ironwood, fan palm, honeybee mesquite, screwbean, and others. Fan palm trees commonly occur in clustered distributions. Various mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, and invertebrates are found within the study area. The peninsular bighorn sheep, of course, is the wildlife icon of the western Colorado Desert. It is the largest mammal in the region. The western Colorado Desert is situated within the traditional homelands of the Kumeyaay, the Kwaaymii, and the mountain Cahuilla. Kumeyaay and the Kumeyaay and the Kwaaymii of Cuyamaca Mountains and the Laguna Mountains and the mountain Cahuilla moved to the desert areas in my study area during the winter and stayed until early spring. Trails used by Native people followed canyons on the mountainside, such as Cottonwood Canyon, Storm Canyon, Oriflamme Canyon, and others, to reach the desert foothills and floor. For example, the Kwaaymii traditionally used the Cottonwood Canyon Trail. For this, they would place granitic cobbles in this trail shrine to assure a safe journey. The movement from one village to another and to food gathering areas and to other resource areas in the desert was facilitated for Native people by a complex system of trails. Malcolm J. Rogers performed the first systematic archaeological fieldwork within my study area beginning in 1924, working as an independent researcher. And later, Rogers continued his fieldwork in the desert as an employee of the San Diego Museum. Rogers surveyed and described sites and features in the desert, including cleared circles and pictographs, among others. Rogers had a goal to survey the deserts of Southern California and Western Nevada, specifically the Colorado Desert and the Mojave Desert, in order to identify full regional cultural synthesis. Key elements of Rogers' work involve creating artifact typologies, identifying cultures, and determining chronologies for the archaeological findings. An underappreciated yet important motive of Malcolm Rogers' field research was his concern that archaeological remains in the region were disappearing due to development, farming, and relic hunters plundering area sites. The artifacts resulting from the fieldwork directed by Rogers in the 1920s and 1930s were curated at the Collections Department of the San Diego Museum of Man during the time of my on-site research in 2014 and 2015. The Rogers collections contain a number of fascinating items that clearly show the skill and ingenuity of the Native people and contained a number of rather unique items. 8 battered implements were in one of the collections, of which 3 are shown here. The 8 artifacts were remarkably uniform in shape, size, flaking technique, and use wear. Battered implements have the singular function of roughening the working surfaces of metates. Flake tools, too, were a common element of the collections. Stone balls were used in games, according to ethnographic accounts. Ceramic sherds were shaped and used for various applications, including patching and sealing pottery vessels. The collection contains objects that were of an uncommon design and marked and ornamented by the makers. Alignments of rock cairns, cleared circles, and ground figures made by the indigenous people who resided in the western Colorado Desert are among the cultural features initially documented by Malcolm Rogers. Decades later, additional studies were conducted by Robert Bagol, J. von Werloff, Oma Johnson, California State Park staff, and other researchers. According to the late J. von Werloff, an authority on archaeology of the Colorado Desert, rock features such as rock alignments and lines of cairns help activate the powers of protection, spiritual security, and fertility inherent in rock and earth. Rock cairns are considered an important form of cultural expression among the human people, according to von Werloff. Oma Johnson, an archaeologist who has worked closely with Native people, hypothesized that such features were created for their use in ceremonial activity. Other research indicates that rock cairns were used at vision quest sites in the western United States or at selected places visited by an individual praying to cure for good fortune or to request supernatural help. Rock cairns could be created by individuals who sought to achieve supernatural power or to renew their power. Those rock features observed in the western Colorado Desert no doubt carried similar cultural significance. Rogers hypothesized that cleared circles served as foundations for temporary residential and storage structures, but saw no physical evidence of that specific function. I too have found that cleared circles and rock alignments within Anza Borrego Desert State Park and elsewhere mainly have no artifacts, always lack faunal remains, and lack common cultural features such as hearths or roasting pits, are not close to water sources, and they invariably occur in isolated locations. The relative lack of artifacts and absence of subsistence remains or other evidence of domestic behavior observed in the cleared and rock-lined circles, a perceptible symmetry to their configuration, the great care with which these clearings were made on the ground surface, their small size, and their isolated locations represent good evidence that they played an important role in ceremonial activities rather than being employed for occupation. Evidence from ethnographic accounts and studies of cleared circles by other researchers supports my conclusion. Clearly, the prehistoric people here took extraordinary care and worked with concerted effort to remove rock and gravels and thus create the cleared interiors of the cleared circles. The rocks removed from the desert pavement surface may themselves have possessed a level of spirituality or power. Quartz rocks, a stone known for power, are commonly found at locations where cleared circles features and other rock features occur. Rocks, as well as other natural objects, could be employed to assist an individual, such as a shaman, in acquiring power. Oma Johnson noted that white quartz rocks might be broken up while sitting in the circle, believing that the high spiritual power contained in these rocks would be released and enter his or her body. Research in the Mojave Desert also indicated quartz rocks would be broken up during vision quests because quartz contained power. In many cases, the sites with circle features are situated on slopes high above canyons, tall and narrow ridgelines, and upon isolated mesa tops, which are locations poorly suited for habitation, but highly suggestive of a specialized purpose, in particular, an individual's spiritual journey or vision quest. While most cleared circle features within my study area served in vision quests or locations to acquire spiritual power, I would suggest that certain cleared circle features in the western Colorado served in dances, symbolized something important in oral traditions, or by some other connotation. These distinctive cultural features were employed in ritualistic behavior. Lori Kachora, a Kachan elder, stated that cleared circles, along with rock art and certain other cultural features, are associated with spiritual activities of Indian people of the Colorado River region. The concentrations of cleared circles, rock cairn alignments at places within the western Colorado Desert probably represent a continuation or westerly extension of the same vast ceremonial landscape observed along the Colorado River. As an aside, I want to point out that Malcolm Rogers' field notes offer an important contribution with his descriptions of native house remains at various sites. Today, 90 years later, the physical and measurable remnants of the prehistoric and early historic native houses largely cannot be discerned confidently at archaeological sites. For example, his notes discuss structural remains consisting of walls in front of rock shelters. At one location, Rogers reported the presence of well-built stone house that featured 3-foot-high walls and measured 12 feet by 8 feet in size. 6 boulder wall houses were found at another village site where boulders would be stacked to produce stone walls that connected large boulders being roughly rectangular in shape and varying in size and wall height. He was able to discern house pits at various locations. Large size house pits up to 18 feet in diameter were visible at one village location. At another location, Rogers saw 5 circular house pits with diameters averaging 11 feet. At this point, I would like to move on a few decades after Rogers' time to a discussion of 2 sites in the western Colorado Desert, the Mine Wash Site, SDI 813, and Indian Hill Rockshelter, SDI 2537. I was very fortunate to have been provided the opportunity to work at these 2 sites during my state parks career. Test excavations by California State Park archaeologists and volunteers under my direction occurred at site SDI 813 in 1984 and 1985. The site, lying at an elevation of 1,600 feet, is situated along Mine Wash upon an alluvial fan or pediment with a north aspect at the base of a boulder-strewn slope overlooking Mescal Bajada. 2 units were excavated at the site in 1984, and 4 more were excavated in 1985. A conspicuous hillock composed of consolidated sandstone and granitic rock divides the site in half. Vegetation is relatively dense within and adjacent to the site and includes several economically important plants. The excavations at SDI 813 and 84 and 85 yielded a variety of artifacts and faunal remains, including thousands of flakes and bone fragments, as well as potsherds, monos, many of which show evidence of pronounced battering, and several were fire affected, shell beads, projectile points, flake tools, and other cultural materials. The projectile points could be identified as late prehistoric period. The count of potsherds from SDI 813 seemed low when compared to findings at other late prehistoric sites in the region. Ceramic vessels and implements seemingly played a relatively minor role in everyday life for the people living at SDI 813. A single unit in the south side of the site produced 25% of all the potsherds. These appeared to have been associated with the agave roasting process. Almost all the ceramics in the site occurred high above the level where the dates of 1090 years BP and 1130 years BP were obtained from SDI 813. That finding is then consistent with the dates for ceramic objects in the Colorado Desert. The shell assemblage at SDI 813 included evidence of certain stages of the bead manufacturing process, and this fact strongly indicates that shell beads had indeed been manufactured on site. Particular bead types were made in San Diego County and then used locally, in particular Olivella spire remove beads, which were the most common bead type found in the county. This bead type occurs at all time periods in historic times. The spire remove bead most likely represents a good ethnic marker for the Kumeyaay. It has been firmly established that shell beads were manufactured within at least one other site in the Colorado Desert. Numerous bedrock features and petroglyphs were documented in SDI 813. The bedrock metates at the site were observed to have three distinct surface morphologies, flat, round, and oval. I would hypothesize that the numerous bedrock metate surfaces on site were not simply employed in grinding plant foods, but also served an equally critical role in processing plants, in particular agave, into fiber by way of pounding and rubbing the plants on the surface. The bedrock mortars exhibited a range of mortar cup depths. The prehistoric residents of SDI 813 probably used the many bedrock mortars found on site for processing acorns carried with them from their mountain homes. The desert would have been their destination immediately following the fall acorn harvest. However, the mortar was also known to be an effective tool in processing desert plant foods as well as small mammals. Agave, besides its importance as food, was used in fiber production. Malcolm Rogers' Tipai informant stated as follows, I quote, "The green leaves of various species of agave were placed on flat rocks or on the backs of metate and the pulp pushed out," unquote. Using a steep angled stone tool, Rogers referred to as a pulping plane. This activity, I quote, left smooth, polished areas on many granite boulders in the vicinity of Digenio villages and campsites, unquote. The Kwaaymii and the Cahuilla similarly used agave fiber to manufacture a variety of important everyday items, such as nets, ropes, sandals, bowstrings, and belts. Species of yucca also were utilized to produce fiber as well as being eaten. Bedrock features represent manifestations of fiber technology in prehistoric times that otherwise might be difficult to detect archaeologically. That is, the unseen culture. The 85 excavations at SDI 813 revealed the presence of 4 roasting pit features and 3 other probable roasting pits. Artifacts are associated with the roasting pit features, in particular quartzite monos and monofragments, and these artifacts typically were fire affected. The relatively large numbers of characteristically fire affected roundstone tools, as well as other tools present within the roasting pit features uncovered at 813, suggest that the artifacts were purposely placed in these roasting pit features, potentially as an offering to ensure good fortune, to enhance the spirituality of the group, to demonstrate the use life end, or other culturally important motivation. A total of 239 cupular petroglyphs and 2 yoni-style petroglyphs were also recorded on site. One boulder at the edge of a distinctive-looking rock overhang contained 213 cupular petroglyphs. Clearly, the native people at SDI 813 recognized power and spirituality inherent in this particular boulder and sought to capture some of it and thereby enhance their respective lives via production of petroglyphs at this spot. The many cupular petroglyphs and the 2 yoni-style petroglyphs provide tangible evidence of rituals conducted at SDI 813 to aid in the maintenance of their society. Rocks, as well as other natural objects, could be employed to assist an individual in acquiring power. Particular locations were chosen for occupation, in part due to the inherent power present in rock formations on site. Cupular petroglyphs, such as those present in our study site, provide access to this inherent power in the rocks. Other outcrops on site are unusual in shape and were viewed as potentially possessing power and spirituality. This concept is attested to in ethnographic accounts. The cultural remains discovered during the 1984 and 85 excavations at SDI 813 reveal a picture of prehistoric cultural activity differing significantly from that reported in the 1920s and 1930s field notes of Malcolm Rogers. The results from 813 are, however, similar in character to findings resulting from the surveys in Indian Valley and Bow Willow Canyon and the excavations at site BW9 in Bow Willow Canyon by William and Edith Wallace and their associates in 1959 and 1960. Cultural features and artifacts found at site SDI 813 and the abundant plant processing features adjacent to the site have clear parallels to sites in nearby locations. In addition, the site exhibited strong evidence of actions of a spiritual nature, and indeed the landscape features here likely played an important role in how the indigenous inhabitants chose where to camp. The findings of the mine wash site are fully consistent with the ethnographic pattern of the western Colorado Desert. The Kwaaymii and other Kumeyaay people, and as did the mountain Cahuilla to the north, left their mountain homes to gather the desert in winter and spring and engage in other social maintenance and spiritual activities important to a viable human society. Malcolm Rogers conducted fieldwork at Indian Hill Rockshelter and the surrounding terrain, which he designated C97. His notes described Indian Hill Rockshelter as, I quote, Mescal camp in and about large granite dome, unquote. He also noted the presence of pictographs, rock shelters, bedrock mortar holes, and bedrock metates here. Rogers estimated that the depth of the site at 2 feet. Excavations occurred at Indian Hill Rockshelter in 1958 and again in 1961 under the direction of William and Edith Wallace. At that time, their work established that the cultural deposits of the site possessed the extraordinary depth of 62 inches and exhibited 2 distinct periods of occupation. Further archaeological work took place at Indian Hill Rockshelter in December 84 and January 1985 by UC Riverside staff and some state park archaeologists, including myself, in which much of the rock shelter was excavated. An additional 9 units were excavated at Indian Hill Rockshelter in the winter of 1986 and 87. Numerous cultural features were documented at this site, and the artifact yield of Indian Hill Rockshelter was both relatively abundant and diverse. Hundreds of projectile points were recovered, including Elko series points and 3 types of late prehistoric points. The impressively large flakestone artifact assemblage of Indian Hill also included almost 60,000 flakes, about half of which were quartz, cores, hammerstones, 5 faces, and other objects. Nearly 4,000 ceramic potsherds were recovered from all the excavations at Indian Hill, most from the upper 15 to 18 inches of the cultural deposits. Brownware sherds were the most abundant at the site. The faunal assemblage consists predominantly of jackrabbit and relatively high numbers of cottontail, wood rat, and bighorn sheep, with some fish remains. Several shell ornaments and modified shell fragments were also recovered. Indian Hill Rockshelter contains 2 distinct and markedly rich components, an Archaic Period and Late Prehistoric Period, and shows a possible break in use during a period intermediate between the Archaic and the Late Prehistoric. This potential break in site use may actually reflect a markedly decreased use of the site during a period when climatic conditions were unfavorable for long periods of visitation to the desert. A radium-carbon date of 4,070 years BP was obtained from an adult burial at a low level within Indian Hill Rockshelter during the 84-85 excavations. This was, at the time, and remains so, the earliest radiocarbon date in the Colorado Desert from an indisputable cultural context obtained under controlled fieldwork conditions. Phil Wilkie hypothesized that an earlier component predating 4,000 years BP is present at Indian Hill Rockshelter as sufficient time passed to allow deposit to accumulate within the rock shelter into which a dated burial and its associated pit was excavated. A reevaluation of the obsidian hydration data from the 1980s excavations at Indian Hill Rockshelter conducted in 2019 exhibited evidence of a relatively intense use between 4,000 and 5,000 and 4,000 years before present, as well as some evidence for use as early as the period 6,000 to 5,000 years before present. This new obsidian hydration data indicate a broader period of use during the Archaic period than reflected in the radiocarbon dates. Such a sizable amount of lithic debitage potentially suggests that a flake stone tool production had been an important activity on site. However, I would hypothesize that many of these flakes, and indeed many of the other artifacts and faunal remains recovered from the site, may have been left on site specifically as an act of ritual discard. In the latter case, the ritual behavior is represented by the act of discarding the artifacts. In effect, there is a reciprocal action between the individuals, the place, and the objects. An ethnographic account I read discussed cult ritual discard and noted that the intentional, I quote, the intentional disposal of certain objects helps to harness the power residing in the place of disposal. Another study pointed out, and I quote, before entering caves or other spiritually powerful locations, shamans would deposit food, tobacco, feathers, and other everyday items as offerings to the spirits. Quartz, the predominant raw material at the rock shelter, has been previously mentioned as possessing inherent spiritual power. Local researchers quoted native elders in the lower Colorado River region about the significance of milky quartz rock. Quote, white is a symbol of power, and the milky quartz was broken to release power and purify an individual as he or she approached a spiritually powerful area, unquote. Additionally, Kachan elders stated that quartz would be, quote, ritually fractured on site to release their inherent symbolic powers, unquote. Thus, we can suggest that the employment of quartz on site and Indian Hill Rockshelter was as much, if not more so, a spiritual act than one of a practical nature. The 1984-85 excavations documented the noteworthy presence of 11 rock-lined basin-shaped cache pits within the Indian Hill Rockshelter. The rock-lined features were found at levels identified as dating to the Archaic period. These extraordinary rock-lined features have been interpreted as storage facilities. The excavations in the 1980s provided no evidence of anything being stored in these features, however. Therefore, the hypothesis of their use for storing foods cannot be directly substantiated, but largely depends on analogy to similar features found in the American Southwest, and that some of the features had been constructed tight enough to suggest an attempt to make them animal-proof. I would hypothesize, however, that these distinctive rock-lined features uncovered at Indian Hill Rockshelter may have been constructed for ritual purposes and were not necessarily used for storage. If any items, whether food or other objects, were stored in these rock features, they represented an offering or other use in the spiritual realm. The indigenous rock excuse me. The indigenous rock paintings situated within the shallow rock shelter on the side of Indian Hill contained pictographs exhibiting a variety of motifs in black, red, and yellow. Other pictographs rendered in black are located in nearby rock overhang, and a faint black pictograph that appears to depict an animal is present in the back wall of the main rock shelter. 3 cupule petroglyphs were observed at the site, along with 4 yoni-style petroglyphs that are situated close to the main rock shelter that contains the deep cultural deposits. Pictographs, along with petroglyphs and geoglyphs, exist within the sacred realm of native culture and are most often identified with rituals conducted by shamans or other members of the community. The multiple pictographs reflect the significant spiritual power present in the distinctive rock dome formation in which Indian Hill Rockshelter lies. Clearly, Indian Hill Rockshelter represents an extraordinarily important cultural site within the Colorado Desert and helps anchor and enhance interpretations of prehistoric indigenous culture. The previous researchers here concluded that a variety of activities occurred throughout the millennium. I would also argue that rituals were no doubt in an ongoing presence here, if not the principal activity, as indicated in ethnographic accounts and the archaeological evidence. The potential evidence of significant ritual activity in the rock shelter during archaic times would be consistent with a time of climatic stress in the region. This could include the construction of rock features on site and pronounced ritual discard. In neighboring regions, this same trend for increased ritual activity beginning around 4,000 years BP has been observed by researchers. One could argue that the presence of burials in the lower portions of the site deposit, that is the Archaic Period component of the rock shelter, suggests the site at certain times in the earlier period was not used for any seasonal habitation, but only as a place to situate the deceased. The granitic dome under which Indian Hill Rockshelter lies is a large-sized, conspicuous, and unusually shaped natural landscape feature. The ethnographic literature of California and nearby regions contain numerous references that such rock formations and other landforms such as springs, lakes, caves, and mountains were held in esteem by indigenous people, associated with stories about the ancestors, perceived as inherently sacred or powerful, and were viewed as places where supernatural power could be obtained. Numerous ethnographic accounts, too, identify caves and rock shelters as culturally significant to Native people. They were places where power can be acquired and lives of people can be enhanced, and they were viewed as entryways to a spiritual or sacred dimension outside of everyday life. The predominance of quartz objects left on site potentially point to a spiritual nature to artifact use and discard within Indian Hill Rockshelter. It is worth noting that the Coyote Mountains, a sacred site for the Kumeyaay and the Kwaaymii, are within easy view of the rock shelter to the east and relatively close in distance. I would suggest that a key reason this specific rock shelter site at the base of the Hukumba Mountains within the present-day Anza Borrego Desert State Park served as a place of significant indigenous activity for 5,000 years involved the perceived inherent power and spirituality of the granitic dome and its contiguous rock formations. This rationale for choosing a particular location is consistent with findings in the studies cited above. The presence of pictographs on the south face of this granitic formation further bolsters this contention that Indian Hill and its rock shelter must have been viewed by the prehistoric native residents as a place of power or sacredness. And again, we must be aware that the material or physical world and the spiritual operate in tandem in native culture. The location of archaeological sites and their contents represent evidence of spiritual needs and of the people as much as the material needs. My research in the Western Colorado Desert archaeology leads me to conclude that this area represents a zone of spiritual engagement akin to the lower Colorado River region. Thus, archaeologists and others interested in human culture should always give consideration to the spiritual aspects of indigenous cultures and be cognizant of how religious and ritualistic practices might affect the archaeological record. And it should influence how we ourselves view the desert landscape. Consider this observation from Lowell Bean, who has worked with the Cahuilla people for over 65 years. And I quote, "Ritual was a constant factor in the life of every Cahuilla individual, always directly ahead or immediately finished. Some rituals were scheduled in routine, others were sporadically and situationally performed," unquote. And I paraphrase an observation by Tom Blackburn. "The intensity of ceremonialism was pronounced among California Native people, and it seems likely that there were few occasions during the course of a year when the life of an average person was not touched by it." Tom Lucas, a Kwaaymii elder, stated, and I quote, "The Indians believed in the spiritual," unquote. So I'm going to leave you with one last thought. Sites with ancient rock constructions, rock paintings, rock engravings, or any cultural site should be treated respectfully and left untouched, given their significance to the indigenous community and to the human family in general. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. We are now going to move into the Q&A portion of tonight's discussion. And as usual, you can submit your questions using the Q&A feature located on your Zoom control panel, and we will try to answer as many questions as possible. All right. First, we have not a question, but actually a comment. This person is Kumeyaay, and she says, her mother told her never to pick up the white stones as they contain power that may have been used by medicine men. The rock would transfer what power it was used for into the person that picked it up. So this is the first time that she's heard this from anyone else. She's 68 years old and she continues to hold this belief today and shudders when she sees others pick them up. All right. So we have Robin Connors out at Anza Borrego said that they found what they believe is a trail shrine resembling a small hill of small to medium cobbles. Is this something you're familiar with?
There is what looks very similar to the trail shrine that I showed a picture of that's up in Cottonwood Canyon that the Kwaaymii elders have indicated was used to ensure a safe journey. There is one down in Harper Flat that I've seen, and it's in a site that it looks with a lot of unique and unusually shaped rock formations. It had a couple of petroglyphs at the site, and it did have a little wind pocket in it, which a number of pebbles had been thrown in there, and certainly it seemed like it may have been used for a similar purpose. I hope that answers that question.
Where did they obtain quartz? Was it available locally?
Quartz is locally. It's present all over. In fact, I showed some picture, and certainly quartz was present in all those declared circle sites and all the other, and it is available throughout the Western Colorado. Yes.
How at risk are archaeological sites in Anza Borrego State Park and adjacent areas due to the increasing visitation?
Well, that's probably a little bit out of my purview to answer that question, but it's certainly a concern that during my career, and I think that all of the state park staff certainly share it, is that we want to be very careful about revealing locations of sensitive sites. and one thing that the park staff have done in the years and is that make certain archaeological sites available for park visitation. In fact, encourage it by interpreting at the visitor center and then leading tours. And the Mine Wash site, which I discussed tonight, is one of those sites. And certainly the pictograph site, which I showed a picture of is another site. And what I've observed at those locations is it's really doesn't seem like, it seems like park visitors are being showing respect for the location. It really doesn't look like it's being, those that are interpreted to the public. It doesn't appear that they're being damaged by visitor use. But certainly, again, it's always a concern in a park that vast, which is. But I think most people that visit the desert park, especially a place like Anza Borrego Desert State Park, for example, I think they respect the desert and they respect they respect cultural sites, and I think those are the kinds of individuals that would tend to visit that location, and I think they have a mindset or an ethos that favors conservation. So it's just something we have to watch for. But I think I don't think it's a significant problem. But I actually would have to. There's probably the current park staff would be a better one to answer that in terms of present day conditions.
And we have a couple questions about marine resources found in the desert. What might be the reasons for marine shell to show up in desert sites?
Well, the marine shells from both the Pacific coast and the Gulf Coast do occur, they said, because they were used for ornamentation. And as I pointed out, actually, there's even evidence, at least in two known sites, the Mine Wash site and the Elmore site in Western Imperial County, both show evidence of some shell bead manufacture. Now, I don't know of any evidence of other locations, but certainly, shell ornaments were very important. They would come by trade. In some cases, a lot of the people that lived in the Western Colorado Desert actually visited the Colorado River, visited Lake Cahuilla, visited those areas themselves, or had kin that lived there, and so they could certainly obtain these. Obtaining objects from the West Coast, of course, a little more complicated, but they certainly could do so. And I think again, it was, and of course, shell beads were important for a number of reasons, and spiritual activities is certainly one, but I think they're important medium of trade, and I think and one thing is also, one other fact is that southwestern people that lived in what is the present day American Southwest sought after shell from the Pacific coast, and so it was, and they in turn had items such as cotton fiber, for example, that they could trade in exchange, and I think so it certainly would behoove the people that lived in the Western Colorado Desert to have those available so they could engage in these important trade activities. I hope that answered the question.
And you mentioned fish remains. Where were the fish located?
Well, the fish remains I alluded to were found at Indian Hill Rockshelter, and those came from they're Colorado River species, but they're also species that would have been found when Lake Cahuilla was actually had water. And even some of the ethnographic accounts, for example, Tom Lucas, the Kwaaymii elder, talks about that his people would go to Lake Cahuilla to fish. And another site where we found fish was it's a site known as the Barrel Springs site. It's in present-day Ocotillo Wells and state vehicular recreation area. And they had ample evidence of fish remains. And again, those were fish that were found, would have been found in both in the Colorado River and in Lake Cahuilla at the time that the lake was present. And so, I think they probably would go to trade. And certainly fish are a good indication of seasonality too, and probably in most cases indicated a summer. Anyways, that's and I don't have there chub, humpback, fish like that were present in the Colorado. They're even today present in the Colorado River.
And why were these sites abandoned?
Well, that is it's a good question, very good question, because both the mine, for the two I talked about, the mine wash site and the and Indian Hill Rockshelter really show, well, the mine wash site shows no evidence of historic use, and Indian Hill Rockshelter shows just a meager amount, a few trade beads, but we do know from ethnographic accounts, historical accounts, and from people themselves that they native people lived there up until into the 20th century. So they certainly was the western Colorado desert was occupied. I suspect that in many cases it was a problem with increased Euro-American activity, because of course the Spanish arrived and followed the route of where Carrizo Creek is today. Today it's also known as the Southern Overland Route, and it later became a wagon route and a route used by stagecoaches. And so people living in villages along there, certainly many native people may have felt like this was too close for comfort, and they moved elsewhere to move away from these. And of course, disease was a problem. But one other thing that that researchers often don't really address, and I'd like to see this research question addressed more, is climate. Of course, we have the medieval climatic warm period that ended, but right about the time it ended, according to about AD 1300, then the Little Ice Age began, and so you have, and certainly from what I've been told by paleoenvironmental reconstruction researchers, that the Little Ice Age had a very profound impact.
See where I left off. Is there any indication or study showing that a particular color was used for certain type pictographs?
I think there is a study of pictographs that do indicate that certain color, and I'm not conversant in a lot of that myself, but yeah, it's certainly, you see that, for example, the pictograph site in Anza-Borrego Desert State Park, those figures are all red, and it's of a certain style, and red is always used in that particular, and it's associated with certain time period and certain people. And whereas we saw that at the Indian Hill Rockshelter, most of the pictographs there were black. And so obviously that there was some yellow, and I think but I want to caution one thing about some of the color about that at Indian Hill Rockshelter, because I remember that Ken Hedges told me once that Malcolm Rogers, at locations where he recorded pictographs, may have done some overpainting himself. So I would be hesitant to say that the yellow that we see in the pictographs at Indian Hill Rockshelter are necessarily native and not an artifact of Rogers overpainting. But I'd like to think he didn't do so, but I'm not sure. anyways, yes, there is, but I can't quote, right off the top of my head those particular studies, but there certainly is a lot. I would recommend that you go to works such as articles by Ken Hedges. Actually, a very good book about the rock art in the region, which I just spoke, is called The Forgotten Artist, and it's by a man named Manfred Knock, and it's readily available at local bookstores. And I would highly recommend, if you're interested in pictographs and petroglyphs of the area, to look at that. I would also recommend that they look at a study of the Art of the Shaman by David Whitley. It's an excellent book, and I would think that would certainly help educate you on this.
And are the pigments all minerals, so that would make it difficult to date?
Yes. Mixed with a binding.
And then Paul Chase says he supports your interpretation as ritual locations, and he wants to know, what do you mean when you say that they should not be touched?
What I meant is that places, for example, like any rock art site, any pictograph site, any petroglyph site, you really shouldn't touch them, and they potentially human oils can cause deterioration, cause problems. The other thing that I would be concerned about is any visitation to third circle sites or sites with rock alignments, or certainly geoglyphs, is that for people that, if they do encounter these, don't walk in them and don't walk through them, but stay back and stay away. I mean, these were viewed as spiritually powerful areas, and I think that's what I meant, and that's what I meant by leave them untouched. Is I just don't hate to see that they just by without thinking, walking in locations and potentially damaging them.
Could you repeat the titles of those books that you just recommended?
Yes. Well, a number of the articles by Ken Hedges, and actually he wrote and he wrote a master's thesis that's potentially available at San Diego State University Library, right back 1970. I mentioned a book called The Forgotten Artist by a man named Manfred Knock. He was a longtime employee at Anza-Borrego Desert State Park, and over a number of over 20 plus years, he documented the rock art in the park, and wrote this wonderful book that was published in 1988 through the Anza-Borrego Natural History Association. I think the book is readily available in various bookstores. And the other one I mentioned was The Art of the Shaman by David Whitley. David Whitley is worked primarily in the Mojave Desert and he's written a lot of articles that related to rock art and to features such as I discussed today. But his book, The Art of the Shaman, is really, it's a thick book, but it's really worth having. I think he has some very good ideas, and I really respect his research.
Right, and we have time for just a few more questions. So if anybody has any last minute questions, please make sure to drop them in the Q&A. Are there any comments about habitat or water levels related to the sites mentioned?
Yes. Repeat that question again.
Sure. Wants to know a little bit about the habitat or the water levels of nearby the sites that you mentioned.
Well, that's a good question, and I didn't really get into great detail of that because I didn't think I had the time in the presentation to do so. But well, I would recommend that they visit the mine wash site themselves. It's the plant cover there is very dense. There's a lot of plants that we would identify as being economically important. There's a lot of agave. There's a variety of plants there that were very important for food and medicine and other uses. And so I certainly and that is not near any water that I could. It's a long mine wash, but mine wash is one of those things where it really would only get water during downpours during the summer. But it's relatively close to San Felipe Creek, which lies to the north. It's not too far away, and even though San Felipe Creek goes underwater, I think that even historically and even probably even still today, it flows perennially, year round. And even if it isn't on the surface, you could dig for it. And certainly the native people in our region would dig wells to get to water. And I think that you could do so along the floodplain of the San Felipe Creek. Now, Indian Hill is interesting because again, there's no reliable source of year-round water right there. But adjacent to this site are a couple large tanahas or water tanks. And so those would be filled with water in times of high rainfall. But and then Dos Cabezas Spring is not too far away, but it's still probably a fair distance that you would have to take a concerted effort to walk there and fill up your ceramic vessel and bring the water back. In terms of vegetation there, now I myself, the vegetation is not particularly dense there, but what I can't account for is that the livestock industry that was present. There were a lot of cattle run through what present-day Anza-Borrego Desert State Park in the 20th century, and that had a pronounced deleterious effect on the vegetation in the park. And so really, in many areas of the park, including around where Indian Hill Rockshelter is, the vegetation is just nowhere, no way what it was like prehistorically. And so for us to for me to say, well, here's what the vegetation is today here, it's really complicated by that issue. And so to me, that's actually another interesting factor of why we have to be a little unsure about how much occupation occurred there, because really water is not very reliable and vegetation is not seemingly not particularly diverse and abundant. So which probably another reason why it may have been used in other purposes such as I described in my presentation. I hope that and one of the things that the other cultural features that I mentioned, such as the cleared circle features and those rock cairn alignment, those are up on desert pavement surfaces, and the vegetation is not very dense at all. It's most devoid of vegetation.
All right, thank you. And for our final question, are there any current excavations being conducted in the region?
Well, again, I've been retired for 12 years from state parks, so I'm not the one to address that. But that's a good. I'll give you an answer to that in a roundabout way. In that there was a very large archaeological project that occurred in the region, and it's called the Ocotillo Wind or Ocotillo Express Wind Energy Project. It's where all those now we see the wind turbines down around the town of Ocotillo. Now that was a very large project there, and no excavations occurred during that project. And I suspect, I didn't work on the project. I don't have first interest, but I suspect that it was at the urging or at the request of the native community. And and I think as a result, they did archaeological surveys, but they didn't. So the point is that I myself feel that if we can avoid doing any excavations, all the better. But no, I don't. But to answer the question directly, no, I don't know.
All right. Well, thank you again, Michael, and thank you to everyone for attending tonight's living room lecture. For more information on our upcoming events, including our next lecture, Textile Production in Historic California, which will take place on August 10th, please visit our website at sandiegoarchaeology.org. Thank you and good night.